All right.
Sure,
Hello, everyone.
on the box.
Thank you for coming. I'm super thrilled to be here, see you, and especially have David and Eric with us this afternoon. I know that some of us have skipped duties, including class. I shouldn't say this. Others are going to come in late because they are in class right now. But we're going to get started anyway. I'm Eliana La Ferrara. I'm a faculty here at Harvard Kennedy School where I teach development economics. And I lead this initiative called Rethinking Progress. That is a new initiative for this year. It's a year-long discussion-based program. It brings together Harvard faculty and students to question how we define and we measure progress. The program is organized into themes. We have identified 5 so far. The first one today is going to be foundations of economics. Then we'll be talking about ecology and planetary limits, innovation and technology, democratic erosion and inequality, and finally, possibly rethinking our economic paradigm. And for each theme, we have 2 meetings. One is a discussion group among a smaller group of us where we read, we discuss, and David was very kind to lead that discussion about 2 weeks ago. And then we have a public event, which is today, where 2 faculty are in conversation. I'm basically only serving as a small interruption between their very deep thoughts. But what we hope happens through these interactions is really that we feel very free to engage in questions that we may not necessarily always find when we do coursework or our own research. And you are a very active part of that. This program is targeted to younger minds and scholars and researchers because that's the research of tomorrow. So the question, we don't know the answer. The questions will be defined and shaped by you, and we're trying to put the best minds that we have at Harvard and possibly beyond to the service of those who want to ask new questions. So before we get to introduce our speakers, who would not need an introduction, but I'll do it anyway, I just need to thank 3 people. One is Surbi Bharadwaj. She is the co-organizer of this initiative. So I wouldn't be able to get my act together if she hadn't steered my best intention in a constructive direction. She's an MPAD MBA student in her 3rd year. And so I think she represents what our program really aims to shape, building on innate abilities, but also giving it some of our own. So thank you, Surbi. Then we have Sebastian, who's a predoctoral fellow at CID. He wasn't recruited for this, but he is also naturally interested in these questions and has been helping out. And then hiding back there is Christine Juba, who is the one who's been sending you every information and has been allowing us to get things organized. So Christine has the unlucky experience of interacting very closely with me and enabling my work here. So the fact that she's still alive and breathing is already a success. Anyway, so thank you to all of you. I'm just now moving on because we have a lot to go through. So let me do these introductions. I'm going to start with David. David Laibson, Robert Goldman Professor of Economics and Faculty Dean on Lowell House. He's one of the leading behavioral economists in the world, and he introduced hyperbolic discounting in economic models. You may know beta-delta preferences if you've done your macro, and basically showing how people display present bias and self-control problems. He has advanced behavioral macro by studying how psychological frictions and bounded rationality affect household saving behavior, retirement decisions, asset allocation. And he has pioneered empirical work on default effects in retirement savings. basically showing how automatic enrollment and choice architecture shape economic outcomes. David has received numerous recognitions for his work, the Marshall Scholarship, the T.A. Kraft Samuelson Award. He's an elected member of the Econometric Society, Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences. One of the things that might be of interest to those of you who are interested in policy is that he has various engagement, including serving on Harvard's Pension Investment Committee. He has served as a member of the Academic Research Council of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and he serves on the advisory boards of the Social Science Genetics Association Consortium and the Consumer Finance Institute of the Philadelphia Fed. One of the things that David is known for at Harvard is that he's an absolutely stellar teacher. So in recognition of his teaching, he's been awarded the Harvard Phi Beta Kappa Prize and a Harvard College professorship. Some of us were lucky to have him, and those are memorable classes still to this day. So Eric Maskin is yet another amazing member of our community, Adams University professor and professor of economics and mathematics at Harvard. In 2007, he received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, jointly with Hurwitz and Meyerson, for having laid the foundations of mechanism design theory. Basically, Eric has taught us how to design rules and institutions that achieve desired social and economic outcomes, even when individuals are self-interested and act with private information. He has made seminal contributions to game theory, contract theory, social choice theory, and political economy. He developed key concepts in dynamic games, including the notion of Markov perfect equilibrium. In political economy, he contributed to our understanding of voting systems, coalition formation, and analysis of inequality. Eric is an elected member of the Econometric Society, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, and the British Academy. Going through his CV, I was a bit taken aback when I counted the number of honorary doctorates that he holds, and that's 19, 19, plus 20 honorary professorships. I thought when you got one or two of those, it was, okay. Anyway, Eric is a theorist, but he's had a diverse range of consultancies and advisory positions. So he's been consulting on antitrust and intellectual property for Google, spectrum auctions for AT&T, stabilization policy for the Brazilian Federation of Banks, and economics of low Earth orbit for NASA. This I will ask you about another time. But he's also a correspondent for the Committee on Human Rights of the National Academy of Sciences, and he's on the advisory board of the International Peace Foundation. So that's what you should aspire to, you know, well-rounded. And okay. Eric is also a superb teacher. He got the Hoops Teaching Prize for senior thesis supervision at Harvard, and I was very lucky to have him as one of my committee thesis advisors, which makes me extremely uneasy now at leading this conversation, because I still feel like I'm in office hours and I may say the wrong thing. But let's get started. So what I think we can do is I'll have a bit of a Q&A on this side of the room with Eric and David, starting on some foundational questions for economics, and then we will open it up to the floor. Feel free to take notes if at any point in this discussion you have something that you would like to contribute or ask. We will not do it in real time because we try to keep track of the, of the sequence, but we can go back to it and there will be ample time for discussion later on. So I'm gonna get started with Eric, and I wanted to maybe one of the motivations we had in launching this group was that we observed quite a contrast in the levels of material well-being, which have increased significantly compared to a few decades ago, at least on average. And yet, if you look at survey measures on happiness or various indicators of psychological well-being, you don't see similar improvements, but rather, they seem to have worsened. So we wonder whether the tools that we use as economists are adequate to explain this discrepancy. After all, we model utility largely as a function of some of these material consumption. Do we have the right model of utility? Does utility differ from happiness? How should we adjust our toolkit for that? And, can even happiness be quantified? So these are not small questions, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on these.
Well, well, actually, Eliana, first let me thank you for including me in this program, which I'm delighted to do. I think this afternoon should be fun, and I hope it'll be at least a little bit enlightening. But on the question of material well-being versus happiness, you mentioned that things have certainly improved on the material front, perhaps not so much on the happiness front. That's actually brought out perhaps even more starkly when we look at comparisons across countries. So a comparison I'm particularly fond of is that between France and Denmark. Materially, they are very similar. They have very similar average income, very similar distribution of income. And yet, consistently on these inter-country surveys, the Danes are much happier than the French. And of course, one big question is why? Now, for the most part, we've been relying on survey data. In other words, people self-reporting happiness. Traditionally, economists have been a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe more than a little uncomfortable with survey data, because there's this idea going back at least to Lionel Robbins in the 1930s, that if you accept what a person says without scrutiny, you might be fooled. Robbins put that even more strongly. He said that it's unscientific to accept the assertion on a person's part that something is better than something else unless you can independently verify that. Otherwise, it's just meaningless in his view. And that view was really very influential. And actually, that's why revealed preference, which I think we will be talking about a bit later, came to play such a big role in economics. If I assert that I prefer X to Y, well, you can verify that. You can offer me a choice between X and Y, and if I choose X, well, I've verified the assertion. But if I say, I'm happier today than I was yesterday, very difficult to do a scientific test to prove that. And that's why we're skeptical, and perhaps rightly so, about surveys. Nevertheless, I mean, you asked, should we care about the discrepancy between happiness as measured by these surveys and material well-being? There are plenty of economists who would say, no, we shouldn't worry about that. Economics is about distribution of resources. Happiness is for the sociologists and the psychologists. It's not part of our discipline. I would disagree. I think our economy exists for our well-being, and our well-being doesn't just consist of what we consume in material goods. So I hope that it will become possible to, first of all, perhaps measure happiness in some more conclusive way than simply by survey data, and then also get into the differences that we see. Why are Danes happier than French people? There are certainly plenty of hypotheses about that. It's likely that culture has a lot to do with it. Our perceived happiness doesn't just depend on our own perceptions, but our perceptions of how other people are experiencing life. A perhaps unfair stereotype about the French is that they are perfectionists. They care about the wine being just right. They care about the menu being just right. They care about the clothes they wear. And if those things go wrong, they suffer. The Danes, again, this is a gross stereotype, are evidently more easygoing. Can we make what I just said more precise? I think that is actually a reasonable goal for economists. Sociologists do it all the time. If they can do it, I think we can make an attempt too. And using our quantitative tools, I think gives us perhaps an advantage in that respect. But there's a prior question, which I already talked about, which is how do we even know how happy people are apart from their self-reports? Well, there are some quantitative data, mostly, I'm afraid, on the negative side. We can see that people are unhappy when there are more cases of depression diagnosed, when there is a greater incidence of alcoholism and other substance abuse. That certainly tells us something about our society. But it may be possible, we're certainly moving more in that direction, it may be possible one day to use neurophysiological data to assess happiness. We already know that there are correlations between brain tissue in certain areas of the cortex and reported happiness. This neuroeconomics is a subject which is really just in its infancy. There are researchers interested in understanding those correlations, probing further to see whether what's going on in the brain as we can measure it correlates with people's subjective evaluations of their lives. I'm all for that. It's science fiction today, but it may be science tomorrow.
Shall I just give a quick set of reactions to a broad set of statements that I almost completely agree with? So the first thing that I would encourage the next generation to do is do a lot more qualitative research than our generation did. There was this mistaken belief that you couldn't talk to people and learn from those conversations. I think that's absurd, and we need to get over that, and that includes conversations about happiness and also motives and all sorts of things like that that belong as part of our science. Speculating about what people are doing based only on the behavior that we observe and never having a conversation about what is their subjective experience, I think, is a bizarre way to do social science. And other non-economists understood that, and economists are very late to that game. Point one. Point two, I want to take a stand against gold standards of measurement. I don't think there should be or will be a single thing that is the ultimate goal of humans and our society. Am I?
No, I'm telling people that they could come.
Oh, okay, I got it. Oh, you were saying your microphone's not working. I'm like, is it? Is that right? So I think we need to be a little more pluralistic in terms of accepting the myriad goals that our society has, and not, as we do in our models, boil it down to one thing: utility. I think that's aspirational and it's convenient, and I think we should get in the habit of not relying too much on that as we do pragmatic policymaking and recommendations to our society. And then finally, I want to also just cast doubt on the whole concept of happiness as a candidate for, or well-being. Not only is it this unitary measure, but there's lots of other competing ideas that I think belong in the conversation, like liberty or meaning, things that may not be the same as happiness. And so I think we should be open, which is not something that comes naturally when you look at an economic model where there's a utility function and it all boils down to maximizing the discounted sum of u. I think we should think broadly about all the competing criteria and still do economic modeling. I'm not throwing that out, but I hope we don't live too much inside our models, which I think tends to lead one to look for a holy grail that doesn't exist.
Thank you. That's great. And in fact, I confess that we polled the participants in the small group about what well-being means in their view ahead of the conversation, because we want to, and many of these things surface, the notion of goal setting, meaning, liberty as well, surely the material well-being, but it's very rare among the answers to find something that's strictly confined to material well-being. So there is that understanding. I think we're a bit more at a loss on how to, to do it. So maybe in that respect, we could go to you, David, and because as a behavioral economist, you've studied deviations from the benchmark economic model of the rational actor. The way behavioral economics has operated has been kind of to study one deviation at a time. So maybe modest deviations in a sense, because it wouldn't quite challenged as optimizing behavior. Would it be useful to encourage future researchers to more actively study full departures from the rational actor model? And if so, how would we even go about it?
So it's certainly the case that to date, almost all of the research in economics has started at the rational actor model and studied some small deviation in a very tiny neighborhood around the rational actor model. And that certainly characterizes my own work, so I'm 100% guilty of, or whatever, proud of or guilty of living in that little bubble. But I think there's an enormous space of other possible models out there that might be good, positive models of human behavior. I'll just illustrate because there's an unfathomable number, but you can think of models where we're busy copying each other, and there's a lot of herding, and it's not sort of rational herding. It's herding that we've evolved to do as other species have evolved to do it. And there's lots of behaviors that are part of what it means to be a social animal that one might not understand well as the consequence of some rational actor model, but one might understand in a very different way if one thinks about, where we came from and how we actually behave. If you talk to people, nobody can even tell you what their Medicare benefits are going to be in 40 years. These are things they don't think about, they don't talk about, but they absolutely can tell you, who's listening to Taylor Swift and what their favorite song is. And we are social animals. We're talking to each other, we're copying each other. So I think there's lots of ways of understanding our behavior that don't live in a extreme forward-looking rational actor model. And I could imagine, powerful departures from the way that I've done it historically. And I actually think that the likelihood that we still live in this little bubble around the rational actor model in 100 years, I think it's pretty small. But I have no idea which of the continuum of other alternatives will ultimately prove to be, and when I say which, it'll be, of course, many different competing models. So the future, I think, is wide open, and some brilliant scholar probably at the start of their career will begin to explore these alternatives and come up with something that turns out to be really good in terms of its predictive power, and will migrate to it. And I think economics could look very different in 100 years. On the other hand, it's also possible that we discover that the rational actor model is the right place to stay. So I think it's a wide open question, and I encourage young scholars to take it on.
So I would be delighted if we came across the model which explains all or most economic behavior better than we do now. Nevertheless, let me put in a good word for the rational actor model. With its perturbations, its behavioral perturbations, there are good reasons for believing that, at least to a certain extent, we are rational. Because after all, rationality means doing what is best for us, or at least what we perceive to be best for us, given our constraints and our information. And there are evolutionary pressures which push us in that direction. If I fail to be adequately rational, and this is an old argument due to Milton Friedman, among others, if I fail to be adequately rational, I will be, I'm not going to survive, or I'll have a lower probability of surviving. So
you'll have 10 children if you're not adequately rational. Does rationality maximize fertility?
So maximizing fertility may not be the best way of passing your genes down to the next generation. You might be better off having fewer children and investing more heavily in them.
But we humans are having fewer and fewer children. So is it obvious that that the rational humans will come to dominate the population, or is it the?
We're not just talking about biological survival. It's economic survival too. If I'm a firm, if I run a firm which fails to do even a rough approximation of profit maximization, perhaps I'm going to be driven out. So there's economic evolution on top of biological evolution, and that isn't going to guarantee complete rationality, but it's going to perhaps nudge us in that direction. I also think that our models, our economic models, are there not just as a way of predicting what people are going to do. In fact, economists are, I think, aware much more today than they were several decades ago that making predictions is very hard. But as an organizing principle, rational actor models allow us to connect many different economic phenomena under a single umbrella. They're a way of understanding the world. And as economists, of course, we're interested in giving policy advice and trying to improve on the way the economy currently functions, but we're also interested simply in understanding. And for all its drawbacks, the rational actor model does give us a unifying principle which allows us to understand our complicated world in perhaps a somewhat simpler terms.
So can I say something about what makes me not fully at ease with this dominance of the rational actor model? If I think in very long terms, I believe that survival and evolutionary pressures back in the day required a degree of cohesion and dependence on society, the group, that was much higher than today. Now we are better able to survive on our own. And that, I think, has gone together with our models basically focus on individuals maximizing their utility, so which works for many purposes. But then when we go back to the initial question about are people happy, or have we achieved what we were after, it might also be the case that because these social relations are not part of what the utility we're looking at, or not part of these calculations, we have failed to account for the fact that they were actually making us feel good as humans. And now we have somehow underinvested in those. We can go back to this later, but in the back of my mind, I realize that I associate this model of individual utility maximization with a certain disregard from this social aspect, if not for constraints that are, binding you, for these equilibrium, social norms, and so on, but not really as argument of things that you should care about and invest in. And again, as I said, we'll go back to it, but to me, it kind of belongs a little bit into the dichotomy between the non-rational, emotional, whatever else that does invest in those, and the fully rational.
Well, this is the right place, the Kennedy School, to mention these concerns, since this is where Bob Putnam came up with the bowling alone thesis for the discontent of the modern world.
Absolutely, that's right, absolutely. So Eric, continuing on this, on what we question, we don't question, rational actor is one, but as economists, we also often do not question the notion that agents must be in equilibrium. So there must be some, convergence towards a solution that works well. And yet, experimental work has shown that, for example, Nash equilibrium is not a good assumption for how players behave in strategic settings. So if we were to think of departures from equilibrium, can we replace it with a more realistic notion? How would we start going about that?
Well, first, let me defend Nash equilibrium. I think it's defensible in at least some settings. So probably most of you know that a Nash equilibrium is a configuration of behaviors such that no player has the incentive to deviate unilaterally. In other words, every player is optimizing against what every other player is doing simultaneously. And put like that, it sounds impossible to achieve. How could you have all these simultaneous maximizations going on? But that's again where evolution might come in. Imagine a fairly stable environment, and imagine that players are not literally optimizing, but they're trying out strategies, and over time they put more probability on the strategies that seem to have worked well, and they put less probability on the strategies which don't seem to have worked well. Let's imagine a dynamical process like that, where players are adjusting over time. Well, it's pretty easy to see that if that process converges, it must converge to a Nash equilibrium. And so in stable environments where there's an opportunity to adjust, we will expect to get a Nash equilibrium. And that's despite the fact that we don't necessarily have especially rational actors. All they're doing is putting higher probability on good strategies, lower probability on bad strategies over time. The problem, of course, when you go to apply that idea is that the environment may not remain stable for long enough for that process to converge. So for markets, for example, where there's very rapid technological change and a big turnover in the set of firms who are even populating that market, assuming that we're at Nash equilibrium seems far-fetched at best. So what do we do to replace that? Well, we have to look at what actors are doing before they get to Nash equilibrium. Before we get to Nash equilibrium, I, as an individual player, have some expectations about what other players are going to do. And I play my own action accordingly. And over time, those expectations adjust. And it's the path of expectations over time that we're now interested in, rather than simply the convergence point, the Nash equilibrium. Unfortunately, the set of possible expectations a player can have about other players is very large. And so this is not something that a theorist like me can sit back in his armchair and predict. There's going to be no substitute for experimental and empirical work on this point. But I'm happy to say that there has been good work along these lines. Drew Fudenberg, for example, at MIT has been working hard on experimental games in which there are different hypotheses about how players adjust their expectations over time. And that sort of work is narrowing the set of possibilities down. It's largely an empirical exercise, but it's one that is possible to accomplish. So I have some cautious optimism that a few years from now we will know much more about how people do adjust their expectations in strategic situations over time. The hope is that there will be some regularities.
And there's an hypothesis of rationality in the way those expectations are formed in this ongoing work, because again, at least empirically, the settings I've been familiar with, there are stark deviations in expectation formation, maybe because of anchoring to past choices, pluralistic ignorance settings where people hold beliefs that don't really conform to what the true values or preferences of others are. So in a sense, that game theoretic work that you are deciding is still within a rational actor model where, or it's allowing
this is experimental work. Okay. So Drew, for example, is looking at actual people in the lab and seeing how they behave. Now, admittedly, these are very simple games where players understand the rules, understand how their actions are related to their payoffs. Out in the real world, one of the problems that players face is they don't even know what the game is. They may not know who the other players are. They don't know for sure how their payoffs are related to their actions. So, but I think the first step is to try at least in a laboratory setting, to have some notion of how people update their expectations through experience.
So 4 quick points. I neglected to say thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm also thrilled to be here with Eric, who taught me Nash equilibrium when I was a senior back in 1988, I had the unbelievable pleasure to be in this tiny course, because at that point, word wasn't quite out what an intellectual giant you are. And so, 10 of us showed up in Seaver Hall for your lectures, and it was the best intellectual experience of my life. So great to hear another lecture on Nash equilibrium today. So I also agree very much with your point that learning is the key, that it's experience and repeated data that comes back in that feedback loop that will create perhaps a better model of how we develop our beliefs and come to, with enough experience, something that looks more like rationality. Unfortunately, a lot of the most important decisions that we humans make, we don't have the benefit of getting much feedback on. So, you pick, you don't go to college 25 times, you go to college typically once. You don't pick 25 majors, you pick a major, maybe you change it once or twice, but there isn't all that opportunity for repeated feedback. Your graduate degree, you haven't tried 16 of them, you're maybe trying 1 or 2. Your spouse, maybe you try 3 or 4. Your kids, you have your 4th kid and decide, oh, maybe 3 was the right number, but there's no, you don't try 6. There isn't the data that would be necessary to do all of that feedback is sadly very present with respect to buying yogurt, which I'm optimizing on, and not so present with respect to, let's say, the number of children. We had 1 child. We never experimented with 2, 3, 4, 5. Who knows? We would be maybe much happier if we had tried. But we're thrilled with 1. Buying a house, retiring. Think about, you go through your whole life, save for retirement, and then suddenly you wake up at age 72 and you realize, gosh, I should have saved more for the last 50 years, but there's no going back. So I agree that with respect to the things that we do with very high frequency, like commuting to work and getting that right, and picking the right road and leaving at the right time, or the right footpath, whatever it is, those are going to be pretty close to rational because we do them so many times. But with all the big stuff, I fear we're not going to have the feedback, and so the rational approximation will look pretty bad. One more thing that I just wanted to highlight, there's this tantalizing literature in psychology about how, when people get feedback, rather than their views converging in some kind of Bayesian way, often you get viewpoint divergence because of egocentric bias. And to give you one famous example of that, there's a study of giving people information about the death penalty. And when you give them these readings, rather than the viewpoints becoming closer, the people who were for the death penalty became more for the death penalty, and the people who were against the death penalty became more against the death penalty. And so I think a lot of human dynamics are, interestingly, prone to divergence as we get the same information as we go through life. So that may explain some of what ails us now in our society.
Okay, so we're going 1 building block at a time. The next one I want to touch on is this notion of revealed preferences, which came up. And back again to you, David. This has been our foundational framework for normative analysis. And the idea is that, you don't maybe so much trust what they say, you trust the choices they make. You interpret those choices as deliberate, and you don't question their preferences. But in a world where people make mistakes, can we rely on revealed preferences, or should we use a different framework for normative analysis? Meaning, first, which revealed preferences do we respect? Which do we think constitute mistakes? What could be examples of these? Are there tools that would allow us to tell the differences? And then if we say, okay, we can no longer use them for normative analysis because there's too much error, what is the alternative framework?
Yeah. So, cards on the table. I'm not a huge fan of revealed preference. On the other hand, I'm not a huge fan of elites like us telling people what's in their best interest. The world never wanted that, and they certainly don't want that now. So we need to be super careful not to throw out revealed preference, which is ultimately quite democratic, and replace it with and I know what's best for you, trust me. No one trusts me. So let me begin with just maybe a couple examples of why revealed preference really shouldn't be our North Star. Just to start with a trivial example, when a 10-year-old says, I want to stay up and eat candy, we all say, of course not. And there's nothing magical that happens at age 18 when you go from being someone whose preferences were deemed to be not revealed, deep normative preferences were deemed not to be revealed by your choices, to suddenly at age 18, you are legally, well, really between 18 and 21 as it comes in slowly, you're suddenly this actor, and whatever you do, we're taking what you reveal to us through your choices as essentially your normative preferences that deserve, full weight in that ethical sense. I think that's a strange assumption. And there's lots of things that we do at all points of our lives where we're obviously quite ambivalent, even internally. Think about the person who's smoking and says, week after week after week, for 10 years, I'm about to quit, and I'm trying to quit, and I'm paying people to give me therapy to quit, and I'm doing all this technological stuff to try to quit, and yet 10 years later, they're still smoking, and they're very unhappy about it, and they're completely internally at war with themselves. And then societally, we do say, actually, paternalistically, we're going to tax that. Not so much because of the externality, which is pretty small, but because of the internality. We're taxing smokers. Jonathan Gruber has great work on this, Botan Kazegi as his co-author, showing that we tax people for smoking to discourage smoking, not because we're protecting bystanders from the smoke, but because we're trying to help that person quit. And so the incidence of the taxation of cigarettes is positive with respect to benefits accruing to smokers. And that's because, actually, that's a preference that probably is one that does not reflect people's best interest, and they themselves know it. There's other examples. For example, when we tell 30-year-olds, you must save 12% of your income through Social Security. So when you retire, you're going to not retire into poverty. We are enforcing a kind of behavior, and we're not saying, hey, whatever you choose, that's your revealed preference. If you choose to eat everything at age 32, then you can retire and starve. We don't accept that. We push back on that. And in fact, we don't even require that they save enough to have a minimal level of quality of life. We require that they save enough to actually, in some ways, have a good quality of life in retirement. And we flipped from a world in 1900 where everyone who was starving was old to a world where today many, many fewer people in the US are starving, and they're all children. So we're protecting older people by forcing middle-aged people to save. And we can go through lots of examples like that where we say societally, we're just not going to embrace that whatever you do, that's what must be right for you because you are this autonomous actor who knows their own preferences and reveals them through their choices. And I think we have a myriad set of indicators that help us sort out what is a preference that should be honored and what is a preference that should be questioned. There is no gold standard. We have experts, we have people that we elect, we have people with more experience. We say to people at age 10, your revealed preference is not considered the gold standard for what is best for you, but at age 25, you have more credibility in that regard. We have advisors, we have all sorts of social structures that push us to certain outcomes. We elect governments to constrain us. We do all sorts of things. And so I think we should both use revealed preference as one quiver, or one arrow in our quiver, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we rely on as we think about human well-being or human thriving.
Did you want to? No. Okay. No. Great. Wonderful. Thank you. So I want to go back, Eric, to something that we mentioned earlier. When talking about game theory, and then I hinted at the notion of collective. And you know better than me that when von Neumann and Morgenstern wrote their 1944 book. Basically, they had predicted that cooperative theory would dominate in economic applications, and instead, the profession has overwhelmingly relied on non-cooperative models. And this is a bit strange because if you think about that cooperative theory, it would have allowed us to take into account coalitions, so potentially being more powerful, but also it was in a way less, you needed less detail to be specified there. And why do you think we went down that way? Why did we basically use as a pillar this model where agents do not cooperate instead of cooperating?
Well, I don't, the honest answer is I don't know for sure what went wrong with von Neumann and Morgenstern's predictions, but I have some speculation. So the big difference between non-cooperative theory, which is the theory that economists overwhelmingly use, and cooperative theory, which we don't use so much, is that in non-cooperative theory, we first have to specify each player's action space. We have to say when a player can move, how much the player knows about other players' moves, how the payoffs depend on the collective actions taken. There's a lot of detail that has to be laid out before we can even get to work in the analysis. By contrast, a cooperative game is very simple. For each possible coalition of players, coalition is just a possible subset of players who come together to behave jointly. For each possible coalition, we specify what vectors of payoffs that coalition can obtain. So nothing about strategy spaces, nothing about timing, nothing about information. That sounds a lot simpler, and it sounds as though it should be a lot more powerful because we're not relying so much on on getting all of this micro stuff just right. But I think the founders of game theory and those who took it forward in the following decades made a mistake when it came to cooperative games. And that is they didn't take into account externalities. So they said we can describe the set of payoffs that this coalition can obtain for itself without reference to what other coalitions might have formed. But of course, for most economic applications, what a particular coalition can get will depend very much on the set of other coalitions out there. Think, for example, of an industry where two firms are considering merging and forming a coalition of two. First, the question of whether that merger is even going to be profitable for those firms should depend on what else is going on in the market. They can't make that decision independent of other coalitions that might have formed or might be in the process of forming. But this omission is not limited to markets. It arises in international agreements, whether or not the European Union has formed will influence what trading relationships the United States might want to have with Canada and Mexico, for example. That question cannot be analyzed independently of what else is going on in the world. So that was, I think, a serious limitation on the part of cooperative theory as it developed in its first few decades. And as we know, there tends to be inertia in any subject. If you start going down a particular road, it's difficult to turn off that road at a later time. So happily, we now do have the beginnings of a cooperative theory which takes account of externalities, but we don't have enough of it yet. I'm trying to set an example myself by doing some work in that area, but what we need is a critical mass of work to demonstrate that this is a fruitful direction to go in. I very much believe in going in that direction for all the reasons that I said before. I think cooperative theory in the long run should be even more successful than non-cooperative theory, but we haven't got it to the point yet where that advantage can emerge.
So there's nothing ideological in the fact that the non-cooperative version emerged over the cooperative in terms of the model of human behavior. I always assumed there was also some skepticism about our. No,
I think it was more the failings of the cooperative model than the particular attractions of non-cooperative theory. Non-cooperative theory allowed us to take account of the fact more directly that my payoff is going to depend on what you do and not just on what I do. Sure. Whereas we can't do that so readily in the cooperative theory of the 1940s, 50s, 60s.
Thank you. So David, what's your take on this? And also maybe more generally, I wanted to get your sense of this, where this notion of collective fits for you.
So I think there's two issues on your mind. Correct me if I'm wrong. One is the framework of methodological individualism, which is more naturally attuned to non-cooperative game theory. We think of the individual making the decision, not coalitions. And I think methodological individualism has been the primary thrust of economic social science in the 20th century. And even indeed since Adam Smith, really, that's been the primary thrust. So I think it made sense that as game theory developed, it developed in the non-cooperative format for many reasons. You also mentioned sort of individuals who, rather than making choices as an individual, make choices sort of for the group, which is a somewhat separate issue. They're related. And I do think that behavioral economics has emphasized social preferences and said, look, even if you're making choices as an individual, you may still care about outcomes that other people experience. And it goes without saying that anyone here who, well, maybe anyone is too strong, but my experience, most parents put a lot of weight on the well-being of their children, And so clearly that's already a case where we're not just maximizing individually, we're maximizing with consideration, a lot of weight on, maybe even more weight on our children's well-being than our own. I think that extends well past one's children, family members, et cetera. And there may be some sense of community and group concern. I actually find that some of that is quite terrifying, because one of the things that economists have underappreciated is the power of national identity, nationalism, a group identity that that doesn't express itself in a positive way, at least often in human history, but expresses itself in a exclusionary and hateful way. So, you think about National Socialism, that evoked a sense that, look, I'm not really important. What's important is the movement, and I'm part of this movement, and I suppress my individual identity and support this larger thing, which is the Nazi movement or Germany. Of course, I'm talking about the 1930s. So, there's many different utopian versions of humans caring about the group, and I'm sure that humans, when they were wandering the earth a million years ago, were probably pretty interested in the well-being of other genetically related members of the little groups that they traveled with, and may have been more prone to operate as a group as opposed to as an individual, possibly. But in the modern world, the way I see group identity emerge, I find sort of terrifying. And indeed, I think one of the worst mistakes I've made as a scholar is to fail to appreciate the power of nationalism and these group identities that sometimes seem to sweep over millions of people and drive us to do things that are very much opposed to my fundamental values. The contrary example I'd ask you for, are there moments when everyone sort of coalesced in a positive way? Sure, but there seem to be more moments when everyone coalesces in a way that I find prone to undermine the fundamental values that animate my life.
I think this is super important. The question is whether it's happening or not. We may decide not to model it or not to use it as our benchmark model, but if it's happening, should we change our theory to reflect it? And we may not like what's coming out of it, but we may become better at predicting outcomes that we failed to predict recently.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to completely affirm that. Yeah, I think the mistake is that but economics in general has by and large underappreciated the power of national identity. And that is an enormously important force in the contemporary world. And there was a time when it seemed to be, you're all too young to there was a moment in the 1990s when globalization seemed to bring with it the melting away of borders and sort of, cosmopolitanism, now obviously a bad word, and a sense that you were a global citizen. And the sense of being a global citizen has vanished, and even polities like Europe are crumbling. Brexit, other aspects of what it means to be part of Europe, they're all splintering. and any sense of coming together and global treaties and all the things that one might have taken for granted in 1990 that we were capable of, agreeing on goals of common prosperity and being willing to make a sacrifice in our country so that some other country also makes a sacrifice and we do something together that avoids the tragedy of the commons. We seem capable of that as a species in 1990, and more that seems like something that is beyond our reach, and I think it is partly associated with this rise of strong national identity, which is a kind of, class consciousness, but not a kind that I find especially welcome.
Yeah.
But coming back to cooperative and
I've gone far
non-cooperative
afield.
game
Yeah.
theory.
Sorry. I said they were separate issues.
Whether or not nationalism is a malevolent or benign force, it simply is the case in economic life that some phenomena are better analyzed as sets of people working collectively rather than a lot of individuals acting on their own. We're here at a university. The university, for certain purposes, can be thought of as a single actor. It makes decisions on our behalf. Same thing with our country. Same thing with our international alliances, what remain of them. Same thing with unions in labor relations. To exclude collectives from economic analysis seems to impoverish our field. Yes, we can, to some extent, account for collectives in non-cooperative theory by all of the individuals through a well-defined process getting together and forming a coalition, but it's much more cumbersome. And in my view, the field of game theory would be better off if we could go straight to the cooperative theory. And I believe that will be possible once cooperative theory takes proper account of externalities.
So I take it as the theorists who are here, I know at least some, are free to go to Eric's office and start this new direction. So I had so many more things that I wanted to ask you, including going a bit more into policy, but I realized that we want to leave time also for questions. So if it's okay with you, I would just relinquish this powerful instrument and ask you to be.
Maybe it's more a question. So could you maybe speak your question into the mic in front of you, and could you repeat it so that it's in the recording?
Okay, we can do that. So if you want, you can just say your name and which program you're in and ask your question. And if you want to direct it, you can direct it. If not, they will. Okay.
My name is Khatib Basri. I'm a visiting scholar at the CID. My question is, if people purely rational and self-motive, how do we explain revolution?
How do we explain
Revolution.
revolution?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if you believe that, the self-motive and purely rational, you will end up with equilibrium. So the possibility of change will be limited. But how do we explain the case of revolution, for example, has to do with the issue of this norm, nationalism. Maybe the cost is even higher than the benefit. How do we explain that?
I can try to have a.
If you can repeat the question and
So the question is, how can you reconcile revolutions with rational behavior? A lot of work, let me take a game theorist's perspective on that question. A lot of work in game theory since about 1980 or so has been on what we call games of incomplete information. These are games where players don't necessarily know the payoff functions of other players. They may not even know with precision the actions that other players can take. And in games of incomplete information, it's quite possible for me as the dictator of my country, despite the fact that I'm completely rational, to miscalculate the degree of unhappiness that a certain segment of the population bears toward me. And this is simply because of my limited information. And I also may underestimate their ability to mobilize forces against me. So I suspect that at least for some parties involved in a revolution, the revolution came as a surprise. Not because they were irrational, but because they didn't have full information.
So I'm curious what your reading list would consist of. As you were talking about, especially non-cooperative game theory, what came to mind is there's this quote from Eleanor Ostrom about how essentially economics took a wrong turn when we started focusing on people making decisions in isolation. And it seems like she at least has done some of what you're prescribing, qualitative work and going out and looking at how people behave in these communities. So I'm not looking for your endorsement of Eleanor Ostrom.
I'm actually quite happy to endorse her. In fact, I put her on my reading list.
I'm curious who else you would suggest to people to look at.
Well, let me say why I include Ostrom on some of my reading lists. And again, this points to, I think, a shortcoming in economics, which is we typically assume that contracts are enforced by the legal system. If you and I have a contract, what stops one of us from breaching that contract? Well, the other will haul us into court, and a judge will try to put the breach right. But Ostrom noted, she studied societies without formal legal systems, and she discovered that they worked perfectly well when it came to contract enforcement. And the reason they worked well was because they had got into a more or less cooperative game. If you and I had a contract and I breached it, there was no judge, but someone else observing our relationship would punish me. And if that person failed to punish me, she in turn would be punished by someone else. And so the society was held together by a set of mutually enforcing expectations.
But that's a Nash equilibrium. I mean, you've literally just described a Nash equilibrium.
It is a Nash equilibrium, but it's a Nash equilibrium of a particularly beneficial sort.
Absolutely.
Why that Nash equilibrium rather than the millions of others that could arise? She argued that these societies without formal legal systems were able to select the right one.
I guess the question is, what is the methodological foundation on which we build these things? Is it collective action, or is it a system that isn't called a court, but is called the elders who punish people who deviate? So the very second lecture we give in Econ 101, which is here called Ec 10, is about the tragedy of the commons. And
that's another Nash equilibrium.
Right,
Not such a good one.
we discuss the various solutions, and if you were to go across the world and ask what do the solutions look like that are working, overwhelmingly, they don't look like collective action. They look like some system of enforcement, either formal or informal, but definitely enforcement as opposed to some organic coalition. So I guess I'm a little bit, though I'm a big fan of Elinor Ostrom as well, I'm concerned that the empirical evidence that that's been a robust way of getting humans to cooperate is extremely poor. And I'll give you an example that really keeps me up at night. There's a climate change disaster that is coming, that is not just coming, we're in the middle of it, and it's getting worse by the day, and it's because we humans are not good at jointly doing the right thing, and we need something like a carbon tax or a greenhouse gas tax to incentivize us to do the right thing. And I'm quite concerned that aspirations for some coalition that forms organically is holding us back from actually solving the problem using the old tool, which is a tax. And we're driving over the cliff. So I don't think there's an answer. I was questioning all of the things that you listed. So I would say the easiest thing to do is to say, oh, there's this utility function, and we just need to make it richer and add other considerations, like the welfare of my neighbor or my identity or the way I express myself as an American. So we could, take the existing framework and change the utility function and stay with the current paradigm. We could also adjust the discount function, which has been a particular focus in my own work. And again, that's kind of pretty much inside the paradigm. Or we could do something really radical and say, approximating human behavior, or even as a normative framework, using discounted utility or any utility representation as a way of understanding what people will do or what people should do is itself a highly restrictive, maybe deeply misleading framework for doing social science, for doing economics. And there are other models that will predict what people do and other frameworks for engaging in ethical evaluation other than revealed preference. And yeah, I think that's open as a possibility. I think there's a tendency for us to implicitly preclude that more radical move because everything in the journals is utility maximization or utility-based normative economics. And no one is doing, not no one, there's very little of this other stuff. But there's agent-based models and other things out there. It's not that it's completely non-existent, it's just that you're not taught it in graduate school, and there are a few role models to look to who are doing it. And it's a hugely risky thing to try to step out of the paradigm altogether, which is why folks that have been successful to date have largely stayed in that little bubble around the paradigm. But I'm acknowledging that that's not an inherent necessity of doing social science. It's just the way it's been done by economists for 100 years.
And it has to be said, although we're spending this session mostly poking holes in economics, which is, and it deserves those holes to be poked, economics has had plenty of success. And I would say if we find something better, by all means, go in that direction. But if we're stuck, at least for the foreseeable future, with rational actor models, with perturbations, that's not such a terrible thing either. We're doing, if not great, at least pretty good with that framework.
Yeah,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I kind of share your view that it's not completely off the rails and there isn't an obvious alternative, but how would you know, why do you feel that we're doing pretty good? Sometimes I feel exactly as you feel, that this is sort of the right framework and we should keep pushing in this direction. But sometimes I pause and I say to myself, well, what metrics do I have that would tell me that it's actually working out pretty well inside the bubble, given that I sort of don't have a clue of what the alternative looks like?
I think one metric is whether we as individual scholars and we as a profession can point to different phenomena we see in the world out there and offer a compelling story for what is going on. I would say that a lot of the time we can. And in those cases where we can't, where, for example, before behavioral economics came along, there seemed to be a disconnect between the predictions of the theory and the behavior in the world. When there is such a disconnect, we develop a modification of the theory that can handle that disconnect. So am I satisfied with economics as it now stands? Far from it. But do I think that it's worthless? Far from that too.
Absolutely not.
So there's Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My name is Tom. I'm an MBA student here at Penn School. I have a couple of questions, if I may. The first is on the utility rate. Just discussed about assumptions and utility functions. A lot of the work that's done, at least academic view, focuses on utility and in a way has to simplify it in terms that are usually financial, which works in the case of firms, for example, or you can quantify it. And it assumes that anything that is not quantifiable or not measured by certain standards is not rational. Um, is there a way to, I guess, who decides? I think you touched on this earlier. Who decides what's rational for us as an individual or for a certain group? Because I think a lot of factors affect that. And the second part has to do with the behavioral economics, and something that you also touched on this. Um, where do we draw the line between the libertarian paternalism? Uh, when is it okay and when is it overboard? Ethically speaking, for example, when is it nudging and when is it manipulation? I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And sorry, actually, let's collect 3 at a time so that we get a sense too. So there were 2 more. Actually, yeah, you were one of the first to raise your hand, and then we'll go to her, and then we do a second round. Yeah.
My name is Lev. I'm a student here. Actually, I'm not coming from economy. I come from social science, ecology, education, social change. From my perspective, for economists, there is very dominant role in, let's call it macro policy making or macro management of government level. From my perspective, Ministry of Education or some other, I saw a lot of economists make decision and lots of people do it. Maybe it's different in different places of countries, but my question is, are you agree or not that there is economists have this dominance, and in some cases or in many cases there is kind of distance between economists and other professional or social science specialists. Sometimes economists make decision or without close involvement of doctors, educators, psychologists. And do you think is right? Is the reason for it? If it is, or with some kind of gap, that is probably better to make difference and to make some more interdisciplinary collaboration between economy and the other disciplines.
One more.
I'm Catherine, I'm a second year economics student. So David acknowledged that there's great risk and strain in the development framework. And I think that has a lot to do with publishing incentives and also incentives in career progression in economics. And we deal with incentives in the field. I'm curious if you think there are ways that we can change these things, especially as like tenured faculty.
May I take that last question, because actually I'm involved in a project at the moment directed toward exactly that. David and I have a colleague, Roland Fryer, who has started a prize to be given to, it's not just economists, political scientists, and I think sociologists are eligible as well. Quantitative social scientists who propose a heretical idea, an idea that goes against the conventional wisdom of the profession, but then turns out to be successful in the sense that at least over time, it changes people's minds. I've joined Roland on the selection committee. It hasn't been announced yet, so I might be I might be getting ahead of the story, but it will be announced, I think, within the next few weeks, the creation of the prize. That I don't pretend that one prize like this is going to change research trajectories dramatically, but it might change them a bit, at least with some acknowledgement that radically different ideas are worth encouraging from time to time.
I suspect your PhD thesis might have seemed very heretical when you wrote it, and that it was a huge success. So maybe there's hope for deviating a little bit. No, don't take any more on this. I just wanted to mention that I think David is one.
So I'll answer the other two questions. Yeah. So I agree with Lev that consultation would be beneficial. More consultation would be beneficial. I do think that there's a problem of bandwidth. Often policy is made in a rush, and that's, I think, part of the problem, that we should slow things down and go out into the field and measure policies with field experiments and bring in people that are not just economists and develop a richer empirical body of evidence and a consultative, qualitative science piece that accompanies new policy making. And that cuts against the way that policy is actually made, because it's made by elected officials who want to say, we did something. And that's a bad way to make policy. So I think there's a kind of culture change of getting away from everything has to happen in a 2-year period to, we're going to run a trial and it's going to take 4 years, and then we're going to find out whether it worked or not. So yes, consultation, and yes, slower policy when possible. Now, regarding your question about who decides, the old framework, the existing framework is you decide. You get to basically reveal your preferences and whatever you prefer. Would you like mustard or ketchup? Well, ketchup, great. Then that is your preference, and that's what you should get. Except it sometimes gets into problematic categories when people do things that seem self-defeating, like the student that doesn't ever do their homework and acts out in class and then drops out of high school. Is that your preference? And we should just, say if you want to drop out of high school and learn nothing, then that's what you want? Or should we societally intervene and support that student and maybe figure out why they're not thriving in high school and push back? And maybe we should push back in other areas, like the person who, some economists would say if someone wants to use cocaine, as long as they don't use it and drive, then it's fine. Whereas an economist of my ilk might say, well, cocaine is addictive and gambling is addictive. And there's lots of things that we do that are problematic and maybe cut against the idea of autonomy. And we should reconsider whether those really are in the person's best interest, even though they're choosing to do it. Which gets me to your question about nudging. Yeah, I think sometimes nudging can be for evil. And we have to ask ourselves, who is designing the nudge? And is it actually aligned with our best guess as to people's well-being? And often you can ask people, here's a nudge that basically makes it impossible to quit a streaming service by hiding the quitting technology deep in the layers of the app. Is that a good nudge? Of course not. That's a nudge that's designed to maximize the profits of, Netflix, let's say. I'm not sure whether they have a good or bad quitting technology, but plenty of them have a bad quitting technology. Disney, for example, Hulu, for example, have had terrible technologies for quitting the app. And we definitely need to ask ourselves, who's controlling the nudge? Is it actually socially aligned? And then try to push back on the bad nudging. That's been done by some governments using typically lawsuits as their modality for pushing back. We don't yet have a regulatory framework for bad nudges, but maybe someday someone will figure out a way to systematize the difference between a good and a bad nudge and good and bad paternalism. These are big questions that we struggle with as behavioral economists, as general economists, and it's not so easy to tell the difference between totalitarianism and utopia. Systematizing that difference is hard, even though you sort of know it when you see it.
Thank you. So, Nicholas, David needs to leave in 2 minutes, so either you have a very...
Actually, I need to leave. I need to literally be out the door at 5 of 6.
Oh, wow.
But I need to.
okay.
But I can't like be talking. I need to be out the door at 5 of 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's have Nicholas and then the two of you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is to both Professor Laibson and Maskin. Picking up on one line, which was the value of qualitative research, I'm curious if there are any kind of frontiers in qualitative research in econ that you think are really promising, and any insights from that, given a lot of folks in this room might either be concerned with some of the research being cherry-picked insights, or aren't learning as much about certain qualitative kind of frontiers in their graduate program.
In Bloomberg New Economic Forum yesterday, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo mentioned that once she tried to convince President Biden to lower tax, President replied that and emphasized that lowering tax essentially means that losing American jobs, and every president will not take risks to do so. So essentially means that maintaining a high tariff will be new normal moving forward, no matter who is president. So do you think that maintaining a high tariff really help with job creation, especially to the U.S. domestic? And what do you think with a high tariff moving forward? Thank you.
So this last one is a little tough in terms of, there are clear economic foundations in our models that have pretty explicit predictions when it comes to protectionism and tariffs. So I don't know if anyone wants to deviate from those right now, but I leave the two speakers to.
Okay. Well, so there is what I'd call a standard economic view of tariffs, which is that in general they're a bad idea. They're a bad idea because they interfere with trade, and if you have two parties trading with one another, that has to be beneficial. Now there are exceptions to that rule, as Eliana hinted at. If you are trying to develop a domestic industry, and that industry is not yet ready to face world competition, you might want to protect it on a temporary basis to allow it to get to the point where it can compete. So that would be an argument for temporary tariffs. If my country can impose tariffs on you without fear that you will retaliate and impose tariffs against me, that can also be a good thing for my country. If I'm a big country like the United States, I have monopoly and monopsony power, which I can exercise through tariffs. The problem is that I may not be able to count on your refraining from retaliating, and so in the end we might both lose. The current administration in Washington has argued that by imposing tariffs, they will encourage companies abroad to move here to avoid those tariffs, and that will be good for job growth. And perhaps over the long run, that might even have some truth to it, but it's hard to imagine that effect is going to occur in any within the lifetime of the current administration. If there is a benefit there, it's considerably down the road. So for all those reasons, I think economists, maybe there are more reasons besides, economists, to my knowledge, have come out pretty strongly against the current policy.
Let's
Yeah.
go to qualitative research.
Okay. Yeah. And just one twist on that. So I 100% agree with Eric. We economists recommend against tariffs, and the political economy would be a study into why the tariffs, despite being discouraged by economists, are so appealing to politicians and the electorate. So I think we should do more to understand why we're not going to win. For the foreseeable future, we're on the losing side of this debate.
Right.
And tariffs will likely persist because, at least for the foreseeable future, both parties in the US have decided they're a good thing, which means something about our rhetoric is not compelling, even though we think we're right. Now, on qualitative research, we're a sort of backwater relative to frontier scholars in this area. So when you say, is there sort of exciting new developments, I would say the exciting new development would be to start to catch up to other social scientists who have been using these methods for decades. Now, one big problem with qualitative research, which may be obvious to everyone here, is that it opens the door to bias. When you start to go into someone's house and start having an interview with them, and you nod your head in the right way, and you ask a certain kind of question, and you wear a certain pin, and there's all sorts of ways that you sort of elicit the answers that you want. So if you do qualitative research, I urge you to bend over backwards to actually do it in a way that minimizes bias by not sort of communicating the answer you want in all these implicit ways, which is why economists have rightly been skeptical of the whole enterprise. But when done correctly, which may be rare, it can be extremely fruitful. So I encourage you to do qualitative research with every effort to extract what the respondent wants to say, not encourage them to say what you want them to say.
Let me give one example where I think it was done very well by one of our colleagues, Stephanie. Yes. Stephanie Sanchava has looked at the inflation that this country experienced in 2021 to 2023, and actually asked people about it. If you look at just the economic data on that inflation, you will see that by the beginning of 2024, real income had, by and large, caught up with price levels. So the traditional economic view of the situation was that the economy was back to where it was before the inflation, before the pandemic. But that's not the way real people saw it. And we know that they didn't see it that way because they elected Donald Trump, whose main argument for being reelected was that he was going to improve their economic situation. And what Stephanie showed is that, contrary to what we economists said, people believed that their real incomes were not catching up to prices. They believed that there was a lag. And maybe even more importantly, she showed that people believed that when they got a raise, when an individual got a raise, it was not because it was an inflation adjustment, but rather that they deserved it. And so the fact that prices were going up after they got this raise was an affront to their status as a productive worker. So and that also turned them against the previous administration. So that kind of well-designed survey work, I think, is a great example of non-quantitative work that can help us understand what people are thinking in the economy.
So thank you. Let's thank David and Eric for a fantastic.
And let me thank Eliana for being a wonderful moderator.
Yes.
No, thank you so much. Thank you. So I think I heard a question about reading list at some point from Ray. If you have any resources that you would like us, or you would, recommend to us, maybe I'll ask you to send them my way, and then I'll make them available, because I think there is a lot of thirst for learning more and looking at a few examples of current research that's trying to spin off in new directions. Thank you.
Thank you.